Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here tonight. Thank you for such a fantastic turnout. My name is David Clark. I'm the Provincial President of Mid-Canterbury Federated Farmers, and I welcome you all here tonight. It's really important that we have farmers that, and members of the greater community that turn out to understand what impacts of legislation can be on our community. So, first of all, from a housekeeping point of view, should there be a fire or an earthquake or any other hooter of loud proportions, there's green lights above the exit doors. I suggest that you hightail it out those exit doors and we'll gather out on the other side of the road, outside the commercial buildings on the other side of the road. So once we've got that out of the way, at the conclusion of this evening's presentation, there'll be a cash bar operating and a cup of tea or coffee and a light refreshment available to you all. So we'd really encourage you to stay around afterwards, enjoy each other's company. We've all been through a pretty tough time with COVID and lockdowns, and haven't had the privilege to be able to come along to big events like this for a good period of time. So we think it's a really good opportunity for us to all to get out and get together. So please feel free to stay around. Our sponsors here for tonight are Rural Co, Stocker Dairy Services, Property Brokers, Farmers Mutual Group, Mayfield Transport, and tonight we've got Craig Wiggins, our local compere and rural advocate. Craig Wiggins is doing the videoing for us, so we're really appreciative of the support of the sponsors to give us the opportunity to run this event. Now, as guests, I'd like to welcome Andrew Hoggard, who's the National President of Federated Farmers. Andrew's here with us tonight, along with... Andrew's pretty busy on farm in the Manawatu at the moment, so it's been a big nudge for Andrew to be able to come down, so we really appreciate this, but I think it also shows the gravity of the situation that we face, that we've got the National President here. We've also got members of the National Board, Colin Hurst and Chris Allen, and Chris will be speaking to some of the topics tonight. We've got Terry Copeland, our National CEO, is in the audience. Terry's here somewhere. I'd also like to welcome Ian McKenzie and Peter Scott, sitting regional councillors, and John Sunknall, sorry. Neil Brown, Mayor of Ashburton District. Thanks very much for coming along, Neil. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is a follow-on or a Mark 2 of the meeting that you may have come to in October of 2019. The purpose of that meeting was to present you with the proposals being put forward under the Essential Freshwater policy documents and to seek a mandate from the community to support the Federated Farmers national submission that was going into that piece of legislative work. Now we're 12 months down the track and we've now got legislation that's put in place. Unfortunately, the government of the day chose to shun the advice of many from the primary sector, and we now have the legislation we have. And arguably, or we're going to contend tonight, that much of that legislation is unworkable and has unattainable goals. Probably in hindsight, it's a shame that there wasn't more credence given to the submissions of the primary sector. But what we're going to do is we're going to explain to you what is reality now for the legislation that's been passed. Now, this is not a political event. We've got no speakers from any political parties here, even though we do have some representatives. It's not about the parties involved. What it is about is a government of the day has passed some legislation. Now it's up to them to take responsibility for the legislation they've passed and then react to how the public and the industry involved in that legislation reacts to it. So we're going to walk you through the good bits and the bad bits of the Essential Freshwater policy documents, so that you've got a greater understanding of the mechanics of what's ahead of you from a regulatory point of view, but also a greater understanding of what the overall impact's going to be on your farming business and on the wider Canterbury and New Zealand economies. So that's the purpose of this evening, and we're going to start out with David Cooper, National Policy Advisor for Federated Farmers, is going to come forward and talk to us about stock exclusion. So welcome. We're actually going to ask all the panel to come forward and take a seat, and then David Cooper will take a run from there. So come on up, guys. Sorry. We're also in the days of COVID, we've got a hand round sign-in sheets. I realise some of you may have well signed in at the door, but we're going to pass clipboards down each row, and if you could put your name and telephone number and email address on there, that would be great, and we'll fulfil our obligations under COVID tracing. So thanks for that. No.
Are we on? Hey, welcome everyone. So my name's Chris Allen. So the stock exclusion, they're a regulation. They've been passed by government. Your regional council has nothing to do with it. They've got no input into where it will apply, how it will apply, or what the offence notices will be. They might have a little wee bit of a judgment as to whether there's a bit of education required before something will apply. So the stock exclusion is around all stock, only there are exceptions to it. So David will talk through what the exceptions are, what those stock are that will apply, where it will apply, but the kicker is there's instant fines. There are a regulation that comes with an instant fine, up to $4,000 per offence, and it's $100 per animal. So if you're not a natural person, be prepared to pay $4,000 each time something goes wrong. So I'll hand over now to David, and he's going to enlighten you with all.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just stand up if you don't mind. So we're going to dance around a wee bit on the presentation. I'll start with stock exclusion, and then we're going to go into the national policy statement itself before Kim Riley will pick up the NES, and Lionel Hume will have a bit of a discussion around what it will mean to the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. So stock exclusion. The stock exclusion regs, Section 360 regs relate to exclusion from lakes and wide rivers. There's also stock exclusion rules relating specifically to wetlands, so we'll walk through each of those. So stock exclusion from the lakes and wide rivers by stock type. All dairy cattle, dairy support cattle, etc. Will have to be excluded regardless of terrain. Beef cattle and deer on any terrain if they are intensively grazed. Beef cattle and deer if they are located on mapped low slope land, and that is regardless of intensity. The stock exclusion rules exclude sheep and feral animals. And importantly, the definition of wide rivers is the whole river and tributaries need to be excluded if the waterway or wide river is wider than 1 metre at any point on the land parcel. We have had some initial discussions with MFE that might change. We've had some initial indications anecdotally that it will now be rivers or waterways with a formed bed only, but that is insufficient, and we'll keep pushing on those areas. And again, it's only a verbal discussion at this point. So low slope land map. I imagine most of you have had a look at where your property is on the low slope land map, particularly if you're in hill and high country. It's really critical for the wetlands and exclusion for beef cattle and deer, again, which must be excluded on those low slope areas regardless of intensity. The maps currently using that MFE map are based on land parcels, not paddocks. So if you have a land parcel that covers a wide area and there is a component of that land that is captured in the stock exclusion regulations, they have mapped it entirely as low slope land, and low slope land, and you must then exclude stock, whether that's accurate or not. And there've been a number of farmers sending photos through to us, standing on very steep land, saying this is low slope land. Extensive farms, particularly in the hill and high country areas, are hugely impacted, again because of the inaccuracy of the map and also because of the regulations themselves. And MFE are verbally committed to changing the map. about 6 months' time. We're not sure what that change will be, how they will make it more accurate. And given we consider the regs themselves are unworkable, we're not sure whether that'll include a change to the regulations themselves. And again, we are pushing for that. So issues with the low slope maps, when they went through the regulatory impact assessment, which is the big costing document for the new regulations, they assumed the costs were going to be 1.1 billion. Our estimates based on the new GIS map and including the areas covered from the MFE low slope map, as it is 4 times that, 4.4 billion. We've just got a slide there, the additional hectares that are captured by the low slope map, and I'll get it out of the way, for dry stock. And again, that excludes opportunity costs, land lost to grazing, etc. So what was intended in terms of the stock exclusion? Cabinet intended in their cabinet paper, hill and high country would be managed through farm plans. And the discussion document itself, when it was put out for consultation, again, hill and high country through farm plans, and only capturing intense operations. Again, in the information put out to sheep and beef farmers, this was actually post-regulations. Again, it's only intensive farming and only for specific animals. So clearly the regulations themselves don't match the intent of Cabinet or what was costed through the regulatory impact assessment. So a small number of exemptions. There is an exemption from the requirement if there is a permanent fence, and there is a definition of permanent fence there. Again, we have had verbal confirmation from MFE they will be changing this, but at the moment this is what stands. That's supposed to be the fence with, you can read it up there, electric fence, etc., and a deer fence. So as Chris has pointed out to the MFE a couple of times, they've got some very good fences that aren't captured in those specific definitions of a permanent fence. So again, there's exclusion rules from lakes and wide rivers. There are exclusion rules from wetlands. The lakes and wide rivers, if you are crossing a lake and wide river, you must ensure that the stock are supervised and actively driven across the river, also the road. They do not cross the same lake or wide river more than twice in any month. And we've had a discussion, we are getting confirmation from MPI, but that is each animal. It's not the driving or the person driving it. So you can capture, if you're driving different mobs across, those different mobs won't be captured. You can drive different mobs across different times, twice a month. The other exception is if it is too difficult to install the dedicated bridge or culvert on a wide river, because the river has a highly mobile bed. And again, we're not sure what that means and what you will have to prove to meet that exclusion. Stock crossings don't apply to sheep and deer. So, stock exclusion regs, if you've got a new farm, they apply as of right now. Dairy cattle and pigs from 2023, and same for beef cattle and deer on that are farmed intensively. And then 2025 for dairy support cattle and non-intensive low slope beef cattle or deer. Stock exclusion for wetlands. So wetlands are defined as those that meet this criteria, or these criteria, those that are identified in a regional or district plan, and that's going to be different per region and per district. Those that support a population of threatened species, and there's quite a detailed list of what that looks like. You can access that information on the Federated Farmers website or from the regulations themselves. And those wetlands that are greater than 0.05 hectare and identified as low slope land on the MFE map. And again, which goes to the accuracy of the map. Again, any new farms, you need to exclude stock from wetlands as of now. And I should say we have no clarity around what the definition of a new farm is, whether it's development of current non-farm land or change of land, and even then you'll have to meet the intensification rules as Kim is going to go over. Mid-2023, any wetlands that are in existing regional or district plans, and then mid-2025 for the threatened species and the low slope land wetlands. So I might just, before we go on to those, so I'll just cover this. So the stock exclusion regulations are blanket, black and white, nationally set regs. So you either meet them or you don't. And an example is those stock crossing regs. For example, if you cross an animal more than twice, you are not meeting the regulations. You may be subject to compliance or a fine. And importantly, as a result of the RMA changes earlier this year, the Environmental Protection Authority now has the ability to regulate if an individual or someone applies to a regional council, doesn't get a satisfactory answer, they can then go to the EPA and say, regional council hasn't done their job, you need to step in. And there is quite a bit of a grey area around how that will happen. I can't imagine the EPA stepping in every time there's a small issue, but it does sit there, and that means that the regional council will have to be fairly definitive in how it regulates these regulations. So before we go to the NES, I'll just jump back to the MPS, which is the big document. So we messed with this before, after we told David what we were presenting. So that is the overview of the regulations. The NPS, you're all familiar with the existing or the previous NPSs. The National Environmental Standards, which Kim is going to cover. The stock exclusion regulations, which I've covered. Water reporting regulations we haven't touched on, and I imagine most Canterbury farmers are already meeting those, but there is a requirement to report on the regulations on your water usage. And again, going back to those RMA amendments early in the year, these dovetail quite nicely. Well, not nicely. So, just to provide a bit of context, over $350,000 New Zealanders are employed in the sector, food and fibre sector, 46.4 billion in export revenue, contribution to GDP. Food and fibre sectors is 11%. That's direct contribution. It doesn't account for the money you pay to your service providers, etc. And Treasury data indicates that the primary sector is one of the only sectors that have held their own over the COVID lockdown. Canterbury specifically, 2017 data, $2 billion, 12,100 directly employed, and a further 7,500 employed in food processing and manufacturing. Chris, you just wanted a bit of a chat about the MPS?
Thanks, David. So we'll just assume that this is all new about NPSs. They're a national policy statement, so they're driven by government. They do public consultation at a national level, so that's what we all do in October last year. They seem to happen in election cycles. So there was one that came out in 2011, then there was a new one in 2014, then that one was reviewed in 2017, and voila, here we are now in 2020, and we've got a new one. Effectively, the old ones we throw out and we start with a new one because it's a completely new framework. There's a lot of things that have been jumbled up, but these documents drive your regional council as to what they need to do when it comes to managing freshwater. They will do the regional policy statement, so that there's a very high level document that Environment Canterbury has, and they will give effect to it, but also some of the district councils will find items in there, whether it be wetlands or other issues that will come up in that. So that is at a very high level, and then out of that will come down to your land and water plan. So the NPS is something that happens, and it will happen over a period of time. The kicker in amongst all this is that NPS will also has some concepts where it will affect resource consents. So I will now hand it over to David.
Cheers, Chris. And as Chris says, NPS is a document that all regional councils must give effect to. It sets, rather than the NES, which Kim is going to discuss in the stock exclusion regs, which are really black and white, the NPS sets objectives and policies that councils must give effect to, and there's been some significant changes in this MPS. Regional councils must change their water plans, apart from minor wording, to meet this new MPS. And will also flow through to other regional planning documents, for example, the regional policy statement, which sits above all the district plans, etc., and guides, sets the strategy effectively for resource management in the region. So the particular issues we have is those new objectives and policies, and they're quite a bit tighter than the previous MPS. There are now 2 additional compulsory values, so you now have to deliver on mahinga kai, threatened species values, and ecosystem health, and human health for recreation. And there is wording in the appendix to the MPS that refers to in the absence of human disturbance. We've flapped that in front of the ministries, and they've said that's not what we intend. They will need to clarify that through their implementation guidance, because to us it looks pretty clear. So the new attributes aimed at specifically at providing for ecosystem health include MCI, macroinvertebrate index, which are missing from the previous. The bottom lines are a lot tougher, and the economic impact of both the regulations themselves and the framework which regional councils consider in respect of economic benefit has been seriously undervalued, or seriously downplayed. So previously under the RMA, regional council will consider economic, social, cultural, environmental. The MPS has now narrowed that down, so you now have a hierarchy where the environment is first, then human use, for example drinking water, and then the usage effectively for economic use. So key issues, obviously Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan has been through a very robust process, and most of you would have been A, involved, and B, would have been implementing the policy direction on your own farms. There are going to be a significant financial resourcing implications for councils. So that includes both going through the planning process itself, and also there is a requirement for certified farm plans, certified and audited farm plans. That's going to cost councils quite a bit in terms of the auditing process, and the certification process is still to be decided, so there's a bit of a Mexican standoff between regional councils and the industry and processes, etc., around who is going to be providing the advice to farmers and certifying the plans, and that'll be some time away, 5 years at the minimum. Because of the greater weighting given to iwi values, regional council will now have to go through and ensure they have a very clear handle on the iwi values for specific waterways, for specific catchments and FMUs, and that needs to be defined in a way that there is surety for those who are applying for consents and surety for the regional council. And they will now require significant increases in the monitoring and reporting on water quality and water quality trends. Again, consent processing costs. Many regional councils are indicating they're going to have to significantly ramp up their consent processing capability just to get through the new consents that will be required as a result of these regulations. And as of September 2020, as of last month, when a resource consent is going through a process, the regional council must consider an equal weighting the existing Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan and also the direction of the MPS itself. That's until they go through this regional plan process, and then those regulations will be set in stone. So effectively what that means is if you put through a consent application as of now, they will consider where you are against the Land and Water Regional Plan objectives and policies. They will also have to consider how the consent will deliver upon the objectives and policies in the new MPS. And again, because the MPS is quite a high-level document and there's a whole heap of new terms and requirements, there's uncertainty around how ECAN will approach to this review, what it'll actually mean for you on the ground in terms of consenting costs, etc., and what it means for your certainty in terms of farming. And so those are the stock exclusion regs we've been through. And I'll pass to Kim for the NES.
Hi everyone, sorry, so I'll hopefully have a better order to my slides. Just try and work out where they're cropping up next, no offence David. National environmental standards, these are pretty much national rules. They came in immediately unless they've got a date that's specified differently. So these are the ones you really need to pay attention to because most of these apply as of now. So for Canterbury, you might have submitted to the national regulations when they come out, and across the country people were submitting going, well, how do you have a rule that applies nationally? What might work in Southland might not be needed in Northland. Canterbury's pretty much got a lot of the stuff covered through the work you've been doing for the last decade nearly in Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plans. So why have a national rule? If it's not going to work for Canterbury, why does Canterbury have to follow the same rules that everyone else does? But here we are, we've landed with national rules, and now we have to work our way through them, what works and what you have to follow now, and what the government's likely to backtrack on next. Because there are some areas already where we've had some backtracking, and there are areas they're likely to backtrack a bit further and try and fix some of the issues that they've created with having a national regulation. So the rules cover a range of areas. They cover intensification, which won't be such a big issue for Canterbury because of the stage your Land and Water Regional Plan is already at. Intensive winter grazing will be an issue. That applies now. There's some carve-outs for an extra month for Southland and Otago Regional Council areas, which I'll get to, but this is an area we'll give a bit more attention in the detail to next, because there are some quite detailed rules around when you may need a consent to winter graze your sheep, beef, whatever animals you've got there. There are rules around feedlots and stock holding areas, and yard weaning may be an issue in Canterbury for that. There's a input-based cap on the amount of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser you can use. That's set at 190 kilograms of nitrogen fertiliser per hectare per year, which will be an issue for many Canterbury farmers. And if you're a dairy farmer, you have to provide the information to the regional council to show how much you're using, and I'll get to a few more details on that next. There are also, as David said, some information on some rules around mandatory and certified farm plans, and these aren't in effect yet, but there will be regulations released by the Minister, and that will come in and specify the content you need to have in your farm plan, which elements are going to be enforced and able to have enforcement action taken against them, and which timeframes and things apply. So that's coming next, and in the next 2 to 5 years I think we're expecting to see those start coming through. There are rules around fish passage and culverts on your property, so when you're when you're thinking about stock exclusion, you also need to think about the fish passage when you're putting your culverts in place. And there are charges for permitted activity monitoring. So even if you don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of getting a consent, there may be permitted activity charges that come through when council goes through to check up on what you're doing. So the cap on synthetic fertiliser, we're not a fan of this because it's input based. The Resource Management Act is an effects based piece of regulation, and this is focusing on what's going in on your farm. And there's two different ways that the limit applies. The first is a cap averaged across the pastoral area of your land holding, and the second is a cap that applies to each hectare of that land. So there are two different ways that applies, and we are really concerned with how that plays, how the input-based approach is playing through. There are rules on intensification which apply until a regional council has given effect to the national policy statement. In Canterbury, again, that won't be such an issue because you are ahead of where a lot of the rest of the country is at. But that is in place until the 2024 notification. It's not ideal, and it's a blanket approach, and it's likely to be useful for those over-allocated catchments where you're not wanting a whole lot of new players coming in. and then needing to claw back where you're at. So that applies when you're moving from plantation forestry to any pastoral land use, from pastoral land use to dairy or dairy support. You're increasing your irrigation for an existing dairy farm above the maximum area that you've used previously over that period. It's increasing the area of land used for dairy support above that baseline period, 2014 to 2019. And again, these apply until that regional plan has given effect to the national policy statement. So again, not such an issue probably for Canterbury, in that your plans are a little bit ahead of where the rest of the country's at. But if you're thinking of changing land use, make sure you're looking at this when you look at the regional plan as well. Wetlands, bit of a dog's breakfast. They're covered everywhere. They're in district and regional plans already. They're covered in the national policy statement that David's touched on. They're covered in the national policy statement for biodiversity, which a few in this room may have submitted on earlier this year. That's coming out April 2021, and the summary of submissions has just come out, and it looks like it's going to again impact people who have wetlands on their property. The government's very worried about two big areas, tussock grasslands and wetlands. So if you've got those on your property, really pay attention April 2021 when the National Policy Statement for Biodiversity comes out. The National Environmental Standard on Freshwater has a lot of rules around regulation, around wetlands. I think 16 pages of rules around wetlands, so I'll cover off a few of them soon. And as David's already covered off, the stock exclusion regulations had wetland rules for stock exclusion. So regional plans and rules can only be more stringent. They can't be more lenient. And that's a really big concern as we work our way through these wetland rules. Resource Management Act has quite a broad definition of what is a wetland, and that includes any permanently or intermittently wet areas, shallow water and land water margins that support a natural ecosystem of plants and animals that have adapted to wet conditions. So it captures a lot. Where the National Environmental Standard comes in is to narrow that down a little bit to focus on a natural wetland, and it says a natural wetland is not a wetland constructed by artificial means. So, but that's not a get out of jail free if you're creating a wetland on a place where it used to be a formal wetland, or you're restoring or enhancing a natural wetland or formal natural wetland. Because if you're going to put a wetland in your property, an artificial one, you'll likely put it to where there was one previously. It's a good place on a farm to put a new wetland. You need to check to make sure that wasn't previously a wetland. It also doesn't include a geothermal wetland, or importantly for many in this room, an area that is improved pasture. And the definition for improved pasture is over the page. But that basically means it's dominated by over 50% of exotic pasture species, and it's subject to temporary rain-derived water pooling, so it doesn't cover improved pasture. So improved pasture is an area of land where exotic pasture species have been deliberately sown or maintained for the purpose of pasture production, and species composition and growth has been modified and is being managed for livestock grazing. So your fertiliser, your top dressing, your oversowing, your carrying out regular farming activities that are maintaining that pasture for livestock grazing. So that's really important, and it's hard for extensive farm systems to sometimes prove that they have been doing this. So it's really important to keep records, show what you've been doing, and just be able to track that you have been improving that pasture over time, because it's really important to make sure you can show this is improved pasture and not a wetland. So that's going to be a really key conversation through these rules and when we get to the Biodiversity National Policy Statement. So any aerial photos, farm diaries, anything you've got, start just collating. Photos that tell 1,000 words, but just keep tracking what you've been doing on your farm to show that you've been maintaining that pasture for the purpose of livestock grazing. So there's 16 pages of rules in the National Environmental Standard alone, and that's on top of the stock exclusion regulations David's talked about and the National Policy Statement. They allow some activities, but if you read the list, it's predominantly the stuff that doesn't capture you guys. It's the restoration, but there are some really tight rules around that. scientific research, the maintenance of public utility structures, which does allow maimai, so that's useful for some in the room. Moss harvesting, the natural hazard works, but again, there's quite a lot of rules around the conditions that you need to meet, and you still need to look through really carefully, even if you are going to be carrying out those type of activities. But for the most of farmers, you're going to be in these camps. So any earthworks, if you're going to drain in any way a wetland, you need to be looking at these rules, because these are national environmental rules that apply now. Earthworks or taking, using, damming, diverting or a discharge outside a wetland, so within 100 metres of a wetland, is a non-complying activity if it impacts or drains a wetland in any way. And that will be one that a lot of farmers are going to have to keep an eye on. And 100 metres from a wetland is quite a big distance. And particularly considering when a wetland is classified, it's factored in a buffer around it. Anything that has an ecological impact on that wetland is generally classified as part of a wetland. So 100 metres beyond that point. So that's a one to keep an eye on. And it's prohibited to carry out earthworks or taking, using, damming, diverting or discharging within the wetland itself, again if it impacts the level or drains partially or completely that wetland. All of these require non-complying resource consent, so a really high hurdle to get across. Any vegetation clearance within a wetland or within 10 metres of it. So that's not indigenous vegetation clearance, that's any vegetation clearance. Gorse, manuka, any vegetation you're clearing within 10 metres of a wetland or within the wetland itself, non-complying resource consent. And that's absolutely crazy when you consider the exotic weeds that a lot of people need to do for the good of the wetland. Carrying out earthworks within a wetland or within 10 metres of it, non-complying resource consent. Taking, using, damming, diverting or discharging water within a wetland or within 10 metres of it, non-complying resource consent. So these are three really big rules, particularly the vegetation clearance. From a farming viewpoint, some of real concern. So issues with these rules, I think it goes without saying, particularly those last couple of slides. Where does this leave the Canterbury wetland map is a question we've been working through with ECAN. The 100 metres outside a wetland is huge, particularly when you factor in that buffer that's already been factored in to the wetland classification. The wetlands are captured in a number of different regulations. Biodiversity, NPS, next one coming. So this isn't just a one-time, your wetland's going to make you rethink what you're doing. They're coming at you in a whole lot of different ways. So the management in and around wetlands is going to be really difficult, and it will heavily restrict some farming activities that you're currently carrying out on your farm. Canterbury alpine wetlands likely will be captured, and this will impact grazing in the summer months and other activities in and around wetlands. That's an area we're really closely looking at. We know there are some really strong benefits to light grazing in the dry times, these hill country wetlands, and that's an activity that we're still putting a lot of work in to make sure that farmers can continue to carry on. But it's a tricky one once these regulations are locked in place. Oops, I turned it off. No, I didn't. It's back. Intensive winter grazing. Now these rules I think were written with Otago and Southland predominantly in mind after a pretty heavy campaign across the country. Unfortunately, the people in this room have also been caught up with that, and your sheep grazing on fodder crops are going to be now complying with the same rules. Intensive winter grazing means grazing of any livestock, including sheep, on an annual forage crop at any time from 1 May to 30th September of the same year. So not just your winter period, it's a 5-month period. An annual forage crop means a crop other than pasture that is grazed in the paddock it's grown. So it doesn't count your break feeding over the winter months of grass, but it does capture any forage crop that you grow for additional feed. Pugging is the penetration of soil to a depth of 5 centimetres or more by the hooves of grazing livestock. Now the crazy thing when these rules first came out is that pugging was just defined as the penetration of soil by hooves of livestock. So any footprint in mud was caught by these rules. And when everyone started to get through how crazy some of these rules were, the government quickly backtracked within a couple of days and chucked in the 5 centimetres. After a heavy rain period, 5 centimetres, I would say most people would be able to avoid pugging of some type, particularly given these apply to all stock. So I'll talk through the rules a bit more in detail. There are 2 different permitted activity pathways that you can go through. In our view, pretty hard to meet either. The reasons I'll go through. But in the first scenario, you meet the conditions which I'll talk through. I think there's 8 or 9 of them. The second one is that you've got a certified farm plan that includes intensive winter grazing. And again, we're not there yet. As David said, we're a few years away from having certified farm plan processes in place. It's a restricted discretionary consent, and if you don't meet those permitted activity criteria, but you have grazed that land between 2014 and 2019. If you haven't grazed that area between 2014 and 2019, it's discretionary consent, and some pretty broad and tough conditions that you have to meet in that scenario. So this is the first lot of permitted activity rules. The area that you're winter grazing must be less than or equal to 50 hectares or 10% of your farm, whichever is greater. And whichever is greater, the different regional plans across the country have greater or lesser, or there's different ways of writing it. But in the national rules, whichever is the greater of those 2, you have to work out and see if you can meet that. If you meet that area basis, you can move on to the second one. Your paddock average slope must be less than 10 degrees. The second little bit of problem here is you can't use that low slope map that David referred to for the stock exclusion. Again, 10 degrees is mentioned, but this is a paddock scale. So they haven't quite explained how you're going to measure the slope of your paddock. They're talking about an app on a phone you might be able to use, but again, there's been no real guidance on when you're standing there. Is it the effective area of a paddock? Are you excluding your gullies? How do you factor in? Is it just the area you're winter grazing? All of that is areas we're still pushing for clarification from the government. The pugging at any one point must be less than or equal to 20 centimetres. So when these rules first came out, one pug, one hoof print of 20 centimetres meant you breached the permitted activity rules. That was another one alongside the definition of pugging where the government went, yeah, we look a bit stupid actually, so we might have to backtrack. So they brought in an exemption. If you're within 10 metres of an entrance gate or 10 metres of a fixed water trough, you're excluded from that 20 centimetre rule. We pointed out quite loudly that the fixed water trough exemption doesn't go anywhere near far enough. When you're looking at where the pugging is around paddock, might be a tree that animals like to scratch around, might be a temporary water trough, a feeding area. There are a whole lot of areas where you're going to have animals massing where you might have a 20 centimetre pug. And all pugging above 5 centimetres must cover less than 50% of a paddock, except for the 10 metres above, which they have now added in. If you get past the first page, you can move on to see if you meet the next ones. You must not be within 5 metres of the bed of any river, lake, wetland or drain. And the important bit there is the bed of it. So not the, there might be a different interpretation to what you're looking at when you're looking at your waterway. You make sure you need to go to the natural bed, even when it's dry. And the real crux, number 6, it must be resown for people in Canterbury by 1 October of that year. So South of Otago farmers get to 1 November, which isn't enough for them. So 1 October is probably sure as heck not going to be enough for you either. And that doesn't factor in things like availability of your contractors. If you're having a really wet spring, is it safe to get your equipment out? If there's been a big rain burst, are you going to be just carting off all your topsoil on the tractor tyres? There's a whole lot of reasons why there shouldn't be a date in this rule, but there is, and that's an area we still need to get fixed. And the area that you winter graze has to be the same area or less over that 5-year winter grazing reference period. So the big issues for us here is that these 6 standards are really hard to meet at the best of times. Doesn't factor in your big burst of rain, a flood, snow melt. That's going to mean on one day you have 1 20 centimetre pug. That means you breach the rules. And even if you get right through winter and you haven't breached them, there might be a wet spring and you can't re-sow your crops and you've then breached them then. So we, in our view, most farmers, until we get this scenario 2 in play, where you can get a farm plan, you are going to need to likely look at consent. Probably more so as a percentage in Otago and Southland, but certainly Canterbury farmers need to look through those 6 criteria. Restricted discretionary consent, again you can see that list, quite a high hurdle to get across. A lot stricter than your normally restricted discretionary consent considerations. And quite general considerations, adverse effects on multicultural values, adverse effects on human contact health. So there's a lot of information you're going to have to compile. And if you haven't grazed that area previously, or you don't meet any of those 2 first lots, the permitted activity and the restricted discretionary, you're going to need to go for discretionary consent. And you have to prove that you're not going to result in an increase in your catchment contaminant load or concentrations compared to the 2nd of September 2020. Now, a lot of that information is not out there. So it's going to be very hard for you to prove what the sediment, for instance, was in your area on 2nd of September 2020. So we think that's set a really high bar, unfair bar for a discretionary consent. And they can only be granted till 2031 at the latest. So this is winter grazing remains a really big focus of our work to try and get these fixed. Concerns go for themselves. Most farmers are going to need to go for consent just for that peace of mind. Unless you're a psychic or a weather a guru, you're going to need to know what's coming at you for the winter. There are a lot of uncontrollable variables like weather that farmers might just need to cover their backs going into a winter. You don't know what winter's going to look like. There's a lot of cost for farmers and councils. I know with working with the Otago Regional Council, they were saying they currently process about 450 consents a year. Just winter grazing alone, they're looking at 3,000 consents. So they need at least 16 new staff just for the first year, and that goes on to the rates bill. So these are really big, important, big costs that are coming at farmers and councils for, in our view, what's not really any material gain given the work going into from the industry into improving winter grazing. And again, as David covered on, the Environmental Protection Authority can also swoop in if they think the Regional Council hasn't been doing a good enough job, or if the Regional Council calls them in to help them with action. So winter grazing is one that we urge people to have a look at and just start getting familiar with. Stock holding areas, I won't go into all these details because I'll take up too much time now that I've talked about winter grazing too long. But the issue around stock holding areas and feedlots is how yard weaning comes in. That's an issue we're getting a lot of farmers talking through. They're worried their yard weaning is going to get caught. So a stock holding area is an area for holding cattle at a density that means pasture or other vegetative ground cover cannot be maintained. So your feed pads, your winter pads, your standoff pads, loafing pads, it doesn't capture your shearing shed yards, your stock yards, your milking shed, your wintering barn or a sacrifice paddock. But the top ones, you need to be looking at these rules. Feedlots intended to only capture, I think, were they 30 in the country that they were looking at these capturing. And again, it's about the size of an animal and the age of an animal. So without this being something we've been told to focus on, I'll do as I'm told and we'll skip past these ones. But permitted activity, stock holding areas. If 90% or more of the cattle held in the feedlot are no more than 4 months old or weigh no more than 120 kilograms, so 90% of them. So that generally means yard weaning won't meet these conditions. And there's a couple of permitted activity pathways for older stock, which are, as you can read there, and again, things like your setback from waterways and the permeability of what your basic area is sealed at, and making sure you're managing your effluent. And again, second pathway, certified farm plans. So once these things are in place, this could be a really good way of getting farmers to manage their farm systems using a farm plan instead of having to go through a consent, but unfortunately we're not quite there yet. And discretionary consent if you can't meet those permitted activity conditions. And now over to Lionel Hume, who you'll be familiar with from a Canterbury planning context.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, all of this stuff has some rather major implications for the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. One of the big things, I think, is to do with changes in process. Greater central control and certainly less regional and catchment-based decision-making, the sort of thing that we've become used to under the water management strategy with the operation of zone committees and so forth. There'll be quite a few tighter limits. A very good example of those is the 24 milligrams per litre nitrate nitrogen bottom line for rivers. That should be rivers, not groundwater. And the distinct, did I say 24?
Yeah, usual was.
I'm drinking, 2.4. And there's under the concept of Te Mana or Te Wai, there's going to be a distinct hierarchy of priorities where environmental matters are placed ahead of human health, human drinking water needs and commercial use such as irrigation. It's interesting just to reflect on how things run under the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. That's a copy of the vision at the top: to enable present and future generations to gain the greatest social, economic, recreational and cultural benefits from our water resources within an environmentally sustainable framework. Well, that's a pretty lofty vision, and there's specific references to ecosystem, habitats, landscapes, that sort of thing, protection of water quality, but some of direct interest in farming, like access to reliable water, primary production and employment, value added by irrigation, rural community viability. All undoubtedly good stuff. What changes are going to be required? Hang on, I skipped something here. Yeah, the CWMS involves the setting of catchment-based water quality and water quality limits, consultation with local communities, zone committees making recommendations to the regional council, councils drafting plans, and then the formal statutory process that plans go through. But under the new regime, the NPS and the NES, there's going to be a lot less ability to develop and adopt catchment-specific solutions. Plan changes are going to be required, so that'll include changes to the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan, plus all the other regional plans that are separate from that plan, things such as the Huranui and Waiau River Regional Plan, the Waitaki Allocation Plan, there's several others. The regional policy statement will have to be changed. There's a deadline for regional councils notifying plan changes, that's 31st of December 2024. And there is some limited flexibility there. Extensions can be sought to various parts of the process. A number of changes are required. There's going to be a new objective along with some new policies. The new objective has to do with the priorities under Te Mana or Te Wai, so essentially ecological values ahead of human health, drinking water, etc., ahead of commercial use such as irrigation. There's 2 compulsory values, Mahinga Kai and threatened species, a bunch of new attributes aimed specifically at issues around ecosystem health, some tougher bottom lines like the 2.4 milligrams of nitrate per litre, and all this is likely to be pretty expensive. Potential impacts. There's going to be some pretty large impacts, I think, on land and water use. Just thinking about the Hines catchment near us. That catchment, as you know, has some elevated N concentrations in groundwater and spring-fed streams. Farms are required to reduce estimated nitrogen discharge ultimately by 36% by 35, and there's a couple of staging points along the way. Managed aquifer recharge will hopefully be used to further reduce N concentrations in groundwater. And after all that effort, which is fairly massive, target nitrate concentrations were 6.9 milligrams per litre of nitrate N, and that was based on 80% protection of aquatic life. The new target of 2.4 milligrams per litre is based on 95% protection of aquatic species. And yeah, 2.4 is a lot less than 6.9, and it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to achieve without some fairly substantial changes in land use. And I guess leading on from that is the question of, what happens when someone comes up to renew their consent in a situation where that 2.4 milligrams per litre target is not being met, or looks like it's not going to be met. Also, some immediate amendments to regional plans are required, and ECAN's just gone ahead and done these. As they're required to do, there was public notification of that quite recently. This includes the overarching land and water regional plan, plus those other regional plans I mentioned a couple before that are outside the LWRP, and they involve natural inland wetlands, rivers, fish passage, various things to do with those matters. That's it from me, and it's now my pleasure to hand over to Ian Mackenzie.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lionel. Now we welcome Ian Mackenzie to the stage to speak on behalf of Canterbury Regional Council.
It's a bit depressing, really, isn't it? And if I can refer you back to Chris's first comments, which none of this is because of the Regional Council. We didn't invent any of this. If I can just acknowledge my fellow councillors, Peter Scott's the Deputy Chairman, John Sunkel, and Megan Hands got left off before. She may not be a councillor for much longer because she's standing for Parliament, as most of you will be aware. So I've been asked just to sort of make some comments about the Regional Council's position on these MPS of Freshwater. Chris is right, we have no discretion on implementing the MPS, the NES, nor any of the other regulations. But I think there are two things that need emphasising, and that's actually not the right... hugely expensive. The first is that this is going to be hugely expensive down the bottom end. So, as Lionel quite rightly pointed out, the Regional Council over the last few years has put in place land and water plans, sub-regional, which include the regional land and water plan, but it also includes the sub-regional plans. And that has come at quite some considerable cost. And I think our latest estimates of $50 to $60 million of ratepayers' money has been spent on putting plans in place. Every $1 million the Regional Council spends is a 1% rate rise, effectively. We submitted, as the Regional Council and on behalf of all regional councils, a very comprehensive submission to the proposed MPS for freshwater, the essential freshwater package, asking that the work we'd already done in putting in place land water plans would be recognised in the regulations, and in the discussion documents around essential freshwater, the government proposed that regional councils, like the Canterbury, specifically the Canterbury Regional Council, would be given dispensation for the fact that we already had plans in place. what is most disappointing by this government's implementation of the regulations is that we've been given no compensation. So the fact that we've already spent $50 or $60 million of your ratepayers' money has effectively been sidelined, and we're now being treated like any other regional council that hasn't spent a dollar of their ratepayers' money on putting in place plans. And why is that important? Well, we think to do the cheap and nasty implementation of putting new objectives and policies inside our plans is going to cost somewhere between $20 and $30 million over the next 3 years. We've only had an indicative cost of that so far, and that'll be refined. But as we understand it, that's the cheap and nasty version of trying to put the plan, adapt our plans to take into account the new regulations. If we try to nuance the new regulations to allow for the continuation of our sub-regional plans, it's likely to be more expensive. So that's at least a 10% rate rise every year for the next 3 years, just to incorporate these new regulations inside our plans. And we have no option but to do that in some form or other. And what's disappointing about that is that it doesn't change the nature of the direction that Canterbury is already going in, because we already have plans in place to address water quality issues. Some might say they don't go fast enough or far enough, but the fact is we've got, we're going in the right direction. We've started the journey, and that's quite a significant shift. We'll spend this $20 or $30 million, whatever it, or more, whatever it is, and actually it won't make any difference to how we get water quality to improve over the next 5 or 10 years, because this is a long journey, and so that is disappointing, to say the least. And I'll just make a note that if anybody has a really bad life and they do follow what goes on at the regional council, you'll note that all the councillors who are in this room tonight all argued exactly this point at our last council meeting last Thursday. The second thing I want to stress, and look, the Feds team have done an excellent job of talking about the specifics about implementation. What we're required to do is go through all our rules and plans, and anywhere where the new rules and plans are more onerous than our existing ones, and if you take fencing stock for fencing of waterways as a case in point, we have to take which is the most onerous of the rules. So in this case, we've got quite comprehensive stock exclusion rules already in place. The low slope in the hill and high country is a new addition, so we have to include those more stringent requirements into our plan. So we have no discretion about that. So where the regional council thought that they didn't need to include some of those waterways in our plans for a variety of reasons, the government has overruled us on that. And so that in itself is part of the cost, the hugely expensive part of putting the new objectives and policies into place. The other thing I think we need to stress, and I've been nervous about the fact that very few commentators have picked up on it, and that is the implications of Te Mana o Te Wai. It's hugely significant. And Te Mana o Te Wai requires the regional councils to give highest priority to the health and well-being of water and water bodies, then secondly, the health needs of people, and thirdly, the ability of people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being. We have to set a long-term vision for the water that is informed by the aspirations of tangata whenua for what the water bodies should look like in the future, and the understanding of current pressures and understanding of the water bodies' histories. There's a whole lot of other wordage, but what it means is that effectively, as a regulator, any consents that likely to have any effect on water at all are likely to require improvements in granting those consents will require that in granting those consents, that water body or the effect on water is likely to be beneficial rather than not cause less than minimum damage, which is the old rule. And I noticed, I think it was when Kim had the rules up, the consent requirements up for winter grazing. If you have to apply for a consent under Te Manorota Y to winter graze your livestock, and there's any suggestion you might do any detriment to a water body, then you're not going to get a consent under Te Manorota Y. So if Kim thought the permitted activity status was difficult to comply with, getting a consent to do winter grazing is going to be pretty much impossible, I think, unless your local runanga smile sweetly on you, because they're the ones who are going to have the discretion and are going to set, as we understand it, set the standard for what complies with Te Manorota Y. So the regional councils, we're doing a huge amount of work or setting in place at the start of the program to understand from Ngāi Tahu and the individual runanga within Ngāi Tahu exactly what they think Te Manorota Y means, because that will then translate into our rules and regulations, which will then translate into what can or can't be consented, which, if you think about it, sets a very high standard. And when we had a meeting the other day on the Manus Aquifer Recharge project we have going in the county here, and we think that the consents for that might be about the only consents we can think of that might possibly pass the process of getting past the Te Manorota Y rule, because the whole purpose of the MAR project is to improve the water quality. It's interesting when they talk about the reform of the RMA and the speed track urban development. I can't see how you can have urban development and give effect to Te Manorota Y. I may be wrong about that, but it'll be interesting to see. So look, that were the two overarching comments I'd like to make, and otherwise I'd like to just congratulate Fed's team, because I thought they did a very good job on the NES and the MPS otherwise.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was very good to have a regional council perspective on where we're heading for this. Now I'd like to ask Chris Allen, the National Board spokesman for water, to give us a national overview and a summation of what we've heard tonight. Then I'll follow on with a local context overview of where I believe we're heading, before we ask Andrew Hogg, our National President, to tell us what Feds are doing to help us through this. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, David, and thanks, team. I was feeling quite jipper tonight before I came along here, thinking, yeah, this is not going to be too bad. Mind you, I probably have been living and breathing it a wee bit. So if I was to break down the stock exclusion stuff, and I've been living and breathing it with Ian for the last 6 or 8 years through the Land and Water Forum and whatever. And there's some parts in that that are a little bit broken, but we could probably make it work. If the government went back to what their cabinet paper was that they approved the stock exclusion regs on, which said it will not apply to extensive hill and high country farms, and that's in the cabinet, item 58. If they get rid of that stuff, have a wee tinker, you could probably make some of the stuff work. Then we move on to the National Environmental Standards, and I was feeling quite good till Kim got up here and started talking about that. And thinking, well, the winter grazing, there's some stuff in it that's just a bit dumb. We know what they're trying to achieve. They've picked the language that's not really that flash, but we can work with them, and hopefully they've already signalled some changes. The ministers acknowledge there's got to be some more. The current ministers acknowledge there's got to be some more changes. We can probably make some of that stuff work. The rest of the stuff, probably make that stuff sort of work. So when they start talking about resource consents, the 190 kilogram rule, it's a non-complying activity. Kim admitted to say that a non-complying activity, it's deemed that you probably won't get that consent. So if anyone thinks you're just going to need a resource consent to be able to put on 190 if that's what you need to do, it's a pretty high threshold, and you're going to have to use some pretty flash lawyers and consultants to get over that bar. And by the way, the consent you'll get only for a maximum of 1 year or 2 years. So it's got a sunset clause in that for the 190. So I thought, oh yeah, that is quite helpful. Kim was trying to really cheer us up with that. The wetland stuff, that was really sort of starting to get to us a wee bit as well, because I've been living and breathing that through the biodiversity process. And then we started getting into the NPS. So that is where the show really starts hitting the road. And sort of going through all the different phases, there's been this real change in the hierarchy. What does this mean? Until I was reading the ECAN, I was one of those ones, Ian, that actually reads your minutes from the last board papers. And in there, under item 14, it talked about your resource consents. So those resource consents coming up for renewal will give effect to the hierarchy of Te Mana o Te Wai. I don't know what it means. I don't know how it's going to give it play out in reality at the moment. But if there's anyone's got to put their hands up, if you've got a resource consent of any sort, whether it be water, land use, or an effluent discharge consent, can anyone put your hand up here? There would be a good 40% of those in the room, would say. So if you're in an associated industry, this is where the rubber's really going to hit the road. Those people coming up for resource consent renewal, there's a lot of cash going to go out of businesses. It's going into resource consents. You might think it's coming to you for some new hardware and whatever. First of all, the farmer's going to have to work out how he's going to get his consent to do whatever the activity is. All the stuff that we've heard about tonight, it's not about growing your business and be able to actually work and you can produce more. It's all about a straight cost on a business. The ministers talk about getting more value for our goods coming in. Well, that'll be good to see that. I think the example of wool, we were talking about that tonight, that hasn't sort of started to show up very well yet. But there's all these costs that are going to be coming in onto our businesses. And it's all we're all trying to head in the right direction, but these are some pretty massive costs that are coming, and I don't know where it's going to end or whatever. This is not like buying a house that's got a fireplace in it, and you're thinking, oh, I've got the clean air rules of National Environmental Standard to comply with, I'm going to have to put a log burner in until they've got to find the right one that's compliant. This stuff's real. But will you be able to get a consent and carry on these activities in the short term? And the answer is it's going to be a pretty high hurdle. So I think that there's probably the best summation I could do and fill in the gaps, that it is all going to come home and it is all going to affect us. But whoever is in the government, whoever's those ministers, whether it's MPI or in charge of MFE, they've got to have their ears wide open and listening to the solutions. They're the ones that have put the stuff there, whether it's National or Greens or whoever's makes up the government. They've got to be solutions focused, because what they've put up there at the moment is going to be a huge cost on us all. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's really good to have an understanding of the national context of where we're heading. For us here in Mid-Canterbury, the rules haven't acknowledged in any way the journey that we've been on under the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan, which set effective limits for activities and then has set targeted reductions for us over time. So what we heard from Lionel was that the Canterbury Land and Water Plan and the Hinds Plains area requires a 36% cut by 2035. Now, they were some very hard to achieve targets that were put in place. Firstly, we limited activity, but then we're going to have these targeted reductions. So 36% by 2035 was going to be hard to achieve and was going to require managed aquifer recharge to help us get there. But we were on that journey. Now, the Canterbury Provincial Presidents of North Otago, South Canterbury, Mid Canterbury and North Canterbury have written to Minister Parker and CC'd the Prime Minister asking for recognition of what we're doing here in Canterbury already and the journey that we're already on and the planning framework that we're working our businesses towards, and asked for the opportunity for that work to continue rather than being interrupted by the new planning frameworks that have been imposed. We're yet to have a reply to that. I guess we can only be hopeful, but we'll wait and see. Now, tonight we haven't focused at all on the good news stories of what we are doing on farm. We haven't talked about the fencing of waterways, the Clean Streams Accord, the fact that the dairy industry's fenced 98% of its waterways, the work we're doing with precision agriculture, the progress we've made from moving from border dikes through to centre pivots, the good management practices that we're employing on farm, and the technology that we're all investing in to reduce the environmental impact of what we do, and also increasing the production of food off our farms. So we haven't touched on that, and that was quite purposeful in not focusing on that today, because actually the bottom lines that have been put in place for the NPS, none of that technology, none of that cool stuff that we're doing on farm, none of that applied management is going to get us to that NPS. It's not going to get us there. So we've got ourselves a problem. Now, as we heard from both Lionel and Ian McKenzie, we've now got in place a hierarchy of Te Mana o Te Wai, which places the Māori of the Wai, the ecological and environmental outcomes, above social and economic considerations. So when a resource consent either comes up for application for a new consent, or more importantly, when each of you go to renew your resource consents, the contestable fact that your farm will employ people, will increase the economic activity in mid-Canterbury, or the wider Canterbury economy, and will provide some of the benefits to our district, such as the event centre we're sitting in here tonight, and all of the social benefits that we've seen across the Ashburton district in the last 20, 30 years, none of that will count in the resource consent renewal process, because there is a hierarchy that must be met. Now, with a dissolved inorganic nitrogen level of 2.4, which is a quantum leap on from where we are at 6.9, or heading towards 6.9, and given that 6.9 was going to be a target very difficult for us to meet, but achievable over time, now that that's been replaced with a target that we likely can't meet, how are we placed when our resource consents come up for renewal? When the decision maker has a legal obligation to central government to place the environmental outcome above all other considerations. How does that work? That's what we've got to contend as a community, and that's actually what the greater Canterbury and New Zealand community, society and economy needs to deal with. So if our resource consents are coming up for renewal at some point in the future, and we have a planning framework in place, that means it's highly unlikely that those resource consents are going to be renewed, or we require resource consents for activities such as winter grazing that have an environmental outcome set at a level that you're unlikely to meet. What levers or conditions are going to be put in place on those consents to try and achieve the environmental outcomes set down in the NPS? And if you can't meet those criteria, how do you move on through the hierarchy of Te Mana o Te Wai to contest that your consent should be granted? So if we looked at this, and this is what the community needs to understand, if we looked at this from a corporate point of view, when corporates are faced with a sunset industry, they look to how they can recover their capital. Right? Now, we as farmers, we're attached to our land, we're inherently attached to what we do, and we don't think like this, but a corporate does. Right? Now, there's little chance that we're going to be able to sell our farms with this planning framework in place. Right? So there's a problem number one. If you wanted to sell out, who's going to buy your farm? So what's the exit strategy if you're looking for an exit strategy to recover your capital, faced with at some point in the future an inability to renew your resource consent? So if I look at my own farm, our resource consents expire in 2035, 15 years from now. My centre pivot irrigators are 10 years old. They have an economic lifespan of approximately 25 years. My tractors, at a stretch, would run until 2035 without being changed. The combine would if it had to. So with the other equipment on farm, and I bet most of the cow sheds in mid-Canterbury, at a stretch, could be operated to 2035 if they had to be. But in my business, and I would dare say in most of yours, by 2035, you will have recovered the capital out of those on-farm assets by way of depreciation. Now that's how a corporate would look at things. How can we recover our capital? How can we gain that, recover that sunk funds out of our business? So the risk for the New Zealand and the Canterbury and the New Zealand economies is that this starts now. That we come to a realisation that we're not going to get our resource consents renewed under Te Mana o Te Wai, and we run the asset down and depreciate it off our balance sheets to a point where we've recovered that capital. But that impact kicks in with every service business throughout the economy now, not in 2035. So there's a risk. So what are we prepared to do as a community? What's the costs? And were we happy with where the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan was taking us to? And are we better with a achievable but difficult to achieve goal in place that we can all get buy-in, we can invest in technologies and good management practices and all the other good things that we're all doing on farm and get to that point? Or do we find that the goalposts are so far out in the distance that we actually lose that engagement? So there's a lot of risk around this, and risk not just for farmers but actually for the broader community. So that's something I'd like to leave you with. I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's something we all need to think about very hard. So what I'd like to do is invite Andrew Hoggard to the stage so we can understand what Federated Farmers are doing on our behalf. And after that, we're going to turn the evening over to you with some questions and answer sessions. So Andrew, welcome along to Ashburton.
Thank you all for having me down here. I wasn't expecting to speak until I arrived in the building. That's always a good way to find out you're speaking that night. Unprepared, just go for it. Look, I guess the key thing I'd start off with is, whilst it's been pretty grim getting to grips with all of this, I think there is some degree of I do have a degree of optimism that we will turn this juggernaut around, in the fact that the plan was that these plans weren't even operative and they had to change them. That I don't even recall a piece of legislation or regulation in my time where that's happened. And this, as you've heard tonight, we've got clear examples here where the stock exclusion rules, how they've turned out, are completely the opposite of what they signalled in their cabinet minute, what their policy sort of intent was. So these are things that are challengeable in court, that can be turned around. Definitely the Minister has signalled that, you know, post-election they'll be looking at making changes, and I dare say basically they rushed this in so that they had a piece of legislation in place before the election, because they said they were going to put a piece of legislation in place before the election. And so they rushed it and they've come up with a dog, and then they're going to have to spend the next term, or whoever's in after the election is going to have to spend time making changes to make this legislation actually workable and practical. So key things we're doing right now, obviously we're talking to multiple audiences, so it's not only where these regulations appear to be hitting hard, so Canterbury, Southland, Otago, where there's really obvious things like, you know, intensive winter grazing, the nitrate rules, but also other farmers. So like in the North Island, farmers like myself that think, well, I only use less than 190 kg of N. We've already got a DIN of 0.44 for our waterway. I don't do intensive winter grazing because it's warm enough, we grow grass. How are these rules going to impact me? And it's not until you get to talk to explain to farmers the NPS rules, which is where it is going to hit every single farmer in the country. And that's one of my worries, is that we'll get a situation where if farmers across the country only focus on, you know, the intensive winter grazing, the pugging rules or the nitrate rules, and they think, well, this doesn't apply to me, I don't need to worry about this, it's just those guys in Southland or Canterbury, then we had that whole divide and conquer rule happening. So it is important to make every farmer in the country understand the implications of the NPS. Also the general public, as David just pointed out, you know, there are some potentially huge costs to rural economies, the support industries, that will flow through into all the centres as well from doing this, as it is at the moment. Now, coming out of, you know, COVID, our economy is, you know, sort of on life support at the moment. Can we really afford this? As they're proposing. And also it's important with the general public. They probably are under this misperception that there are no rules, that it's just the Wild West out there. They don't understand what we've all been through in the last 10 years of regional council rules, etc., and all the annoying stuff we have to fill in multiple times for, you know, processes and regional councils and Uncle Tom Cobley and his dog. And so, you know, regional sector and most importantly government agencies. So we're involved regular meetings with the staff, Kim, David, talking with MFE, MPI, basically just getting it to them. Here are the problems. You know, one of the pieces of work we're doing right now is identifying in the entirety of all of the NES, NPS, every point where we have a concern and what we think are the solutions. So it's not just about saying this is wrong, we're also giving them advice on here's how you fix it and get the outcomes you want. So that's sort of, at the moment, that's sort of where we're tracking with the actions we're doing. It sounds like, oh, you're just talking. Yeah, that's correct, because at the moment just talking is paying some results. We are getting some movement. If the just talking stops getting results, then the other sort of things we are looking at doing, or we may do this anyway, is certainly a cost-benefit analysis. I can't remember who it was put up, I think it was David put up some early slides around the, you know, the stock exclusion. They estimated it was only going to be 1.1, we reckon it's 4.4. You look across all of the other rules, what it's going to mean here in Canterbury of going from, you know, what would have been 6.9 down to 2.4, that's, you know, what's that going to do to the Canterbury economy? The proper cost-benefit analysis of this has not been done. So it's whether or not one of the options is with other parties working to get a proper cost-benefit analysis done of what this all might mean so that the general public can understand. Some other options that are on the table for us are a judicial review. So we can go to basically the court. I'm not an expert on how this all works, but basically argue around the process, you know, the fact that you've got, like we mentioned with the stock exclusion, you've got contradictory statements going on. Arguing, you know, so there's a case of whether or not a judge might be able to say, well, this is in contravention of what you intended here, this is wrong, go back to the drawing board. Also, a judicial determination. So I can't remember who, someone mentioned, David, I think, mentioned around the absence of human intervention written in somewhere in the NPS. Now, we take that as meaning that potentially interpreted, that could mean that we have to get water bodies back to a pre-human state. Now, we could go to the Environment Court and say, is this what this means? Because that's one interpretation it could mean. Certainly when I mentioned that to the Minister, he was no, that doesn't exist in there, and we pointed the page number out to him. And so that's not their intent, but if it's, You know, if a judge rules that actually this is what it means, again, it's going to be another sort of push that they need to change. And there's also a thing, we're not quite sure of the terminology here, but there is a committee in Parliament that oversees regulations. Our policy chief, he knows this inside out, but I can't remember the big title he gave. He talks too fast, basically. But anyway, there is, and it's a very cheap way of doing it. There are risks, of course, because it is a committee of Parliament, so after the election, if there is a majority to the government, who are the current government, then of course they may not rule in our favour, but it will make it a very public process and could cause some issues there. So those are just some of the things that are on the table if what we're working on right now doesn't work. I think that for me the most important thing is getting out to halls like this and making sure farmers and the rural community understand what this might mean, and basically making people aware, because politicians, they're poll driven. If the community is saying something opposite to what they're intending to do, then they will change their minds. So it is primarily about getting the community on board and getting them in behind us. So look, I won't take up any more of your time. I'm sure you've got truckloads of questions.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. The interesting thing about the clauses around pre-human or without human alteration or disturbance, if that was intended to be interpreted by the courts literally, it's not just a rural problem. We must remember that the place that we know as Riccarton was built on a swamp. So it would be particularly difficult to renew a resource consent in Riccarton. So I'd like to open up for questions. We've got 2 roving mics. Well, we will in just a minute have 2. Thank you. Do we have some questions from the audience? If you'd like to put your hand up and draw our attention. One up the back there, do we? I thought we'd be in, David. Oh, yeah, we've got one here. Thank you.
I've got one, David.
Oh, Graham, how are you?
Just on the winter grazing area from 14 to 19, if we're not increasing that area, but it's over 50 hectares, there's lots of winter grazing operations are well in excess of that in Canterbury. Do we need a consent for that or not? It just seems that seems rather confusing.
So 10%. So 10% of your land area, or the 50 hectares, whichever is the greater.
Yes, but if we're not increasing our area from 2014 to 19, and it is over 10%, do we actually need a consent or not?
Yes, if you don't currently need one, that's my, yep. If you don't currently have a consent, then you do need one, even if you're still within where you were 2014 to 2019, because that's 2 different criteria to consider that you have to meet.
So bearing in mind that most dairy sport needs to be somewhere around 40% of your dairy platform, that would mean that virtually every dairy farmer in Canterbury would have to have a wintering consent then.
Yes, you do have existing use rights, which takes you the rules. I mean, when they first came out, they were to apply for next winter, which meant that you would have had to know before you plant your crops this year that whether you needed consent or not. It has now been clarified you have existing use rights under Section 20 of the Resource Management Act, which gives you a 6-month period from when the rules take effect, and these rules take effect from 1 May next year. So next winter, you don't have to worry, but by October 2021, you will need, by the sounds of it, to apply for resource consent if you don't have one already.
Or else we'll all just say stuff and we're not doing it.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble seeing. Have we got one up the top there, Chris? Yep. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Bob Todd under I've got two sons who both farm the high country, and these rules look an absolute nightmare for them. I'm not too sure whether I'm making it ask a question or not, but I don't think people understand the difference between intensive and extensive grazing. And you've got to understand the function of cattle cleaning up the roughage in your blocks. You've got to understand the benefits of cattle and sheep in extensive areas of swamp, which are going to be prohibited. You probably want to look at Helen Clark's St James and the Aorere Ribbonwood, where the swamps are getting smothered in cocksfoot and grass up to your waist, and the biodiversity is probably less than when they were actually grazed. You've got to understand the practicality of fencing streams in the backcountry. These streams haven't read the rule book. And you've got to understand the part swans, geese, paradise duck play in the water pollution. The Guardian reported on Friday the Ashburton lakes. The two worst lakes were Lake Emma and Lake Emily. Lake Emma has been fenced off for years. Clearwater was a bad example too. Clearwater has been part of Helen Clark's Hackatree Park. They also did tests on the Gentleman stream that ran into Maori Lakes from the runs, and they were in good order. So I think the government is going to be damn disappointed at the end of the day in how some of this regulation actually works. Thank you.
I certainly think we agree with every word you've just said there. And I think when the average person hears about many of these rules, they think of dairy farming and they think of intensive farming around winter grazing and stock exclusion, and they haven't got their head around how much this will impact extensive farm systems. And that's an area that we'll have to continue to work on so that people can understand the entirely different concept. So I agree with every word you said.
Thank you.
And me too. With regards to looking at the national environmental, the 360 regs on stock exclusion, without putting someone down, it sounds like the MFE officials have been born and bred in the North Island. They talk about post and batten fences. They talk about posts and two hot wires. I don't think they've seen my wire netting fences or some of the practicalities that we've got going on in the South Island. So all these points, none of them are new to it. They've just chosen to ignore them in the haste of trying to get the regulation out so far. It's been in so many of our submissions, a lot of the points. So we will just keep on continuing until the government gets this embarrassment, and I'll pass it back to
Ian, across to Ian, if you know.
Thanks for your comments, Bob. I'm not going to actually talk about your comments because the Regional Council, when we set in our stock exclusion rules, we recognised all the things you were saying, Bob, but unfortunately we have no we have no discretion now. But if I could just go back to Graham, your question, your comment about consents. I knew I had it in my paper somewhere, but even if you've got existing farm land use consents, which covers winter grazing, they are still trumped by the new NES rules. So yeah, it applies to everybody.
Now I've got a question up there with you, Harry. Hello. Willie. Try again there, Willie.
Hello.
Hello, Willie.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for your good presentation. I've got two questions. One for probably Andrew is how you're going to convince latte shipping Aucklanders who probably make probably a third of our decisions, probably with the help of the Greens, probably half of our decisions. How are you going to convince those people to make good decisions for us. And the other thing is towards environment category. How are we gonna get through this workload? Are you capable of getting through this workload? Are there enough people in New Zealand to do this work?
Okay, I'll give that a crack to start with. I think one of the key things that I've seen recently, work that Dairy NZ's been doing, looking at perceptions of farmers. Obviously they focus on dairy farmers, but we generally have the worst or the lowest perception rating anyway, has been that it's actually lifted a hell of a lot during COVID. So people recognise the value of farmers, the fact that it's keeping the country afloat. They have seen their vision as clear as, whilst it's using up a truckload of my levy money, that it is making a difference. I haven't seen the numbers yet, but they assure me that it is. So there's more of that work that needs to go on. But it's also, yeah, we've got to counter some of the rubbish you see in the media articles, the columns that are written by people that just have never been out and farmed. So we've got to do a better job of rebutting some of that, and also just pointing out the good stuff that does occur. I know it's an old tired cliche, but it's just a constant grind. We've just got to keep doing that. It's making slow progress, but to be honest, I think it is pretty much the only way of just letting, probably not referring them to as latte sipping Aucklanders. Might be a good start, Willie. Hearts and minds, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it's just a general constant progression of that sort of work, making them see that we're just ordinary New Zealanders battling away for a bit of crust just like they are, and we're bloody important to this country's economy in this world at the moment.
That's great. Yeah, Chris, we've got a question over there with you.
Willie,
sorry.
for the second question,
Sorry.
which I think was probably aimed at me, or
It was. Sorry.
I should pass it to the Vice Chairman, really. Capacity and capability that's part of the reason why there's going to be some huge costs to the ratepayers in this process. The Canterbury Regional Council has probably got the most capacity and capability of any regional council in New Zealand, certainly in the South Island, and in terms of trying to get some scale and implementing some of these plans, we are talking to other regional councils. Peter's going to jump in here because he's better qualified to talk about some of these things than I. But if I can just add one thing before I hand over the mic to him, Willie, is that to implement Te Manawa Te Wai, the Runanga need a huge amount of capacity and capability, and I suspect that's probably where there's the biggest hole going forward. And we've asked government to make funds available to help Runanga come up to scratch in that capacity and capability.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm allowed over the rangatahi and make a comment tonight, Ian, so that's good. Look, essentially we haven't got enough money to do what they want, to make this work, to grab more money off you as ratepayers, to implement the rules that they're bringing in place. And the most sensible thing I've heard tonight was from you, Chris, to say that we've already done a lot. We've got a lot of work. You've done a lot of hard work, and we're pretty proud of where we've got to in Canterbury. And to waste $60 million of taxpayers' money is ridiculous. And the thing that really gets to me is the thought that we might do with our farm environment plans to go to a national farm environmental planning strategy. Our farm environmental plans that we've got are a real joint effort now between farmers and ourselves and auditors, and you get the young guys that are talking about the benefit that they have to them. And for that to be thrown out just really gets on my wick.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Peter. Chris, you've got Question.
Yes, there's a couple of things that really concern me in all of this, and the first one is that nearly 3 years ago we had a Minister of Agriculture, Mr O'Connor, made a huge statement that Parliament had just approved legislation that made all legislation have to pass a rural proof test. What the hell's happened? You know, he's not been reminded of that, it would seem. The other concern I also have is that where's MPI? We as practical farmers know that most of what they're talking about is not going to work, but MPI should be surely advising, or at least making public, that they agree with the farmers. Is this a case that our MPI, through its management of employing prison officers, security guards, as the head of it, is actually failing agriculture seriously? Maybe we need to question that, because we're not going anywhere. Finally, David, good work, keep it up and keep the articles coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jeremy, that is good points. We've had some meetings with MPI. We've spent time with them, David and I, with Gavin as well, talking with them what the issues are. And they said, oh, we can't change the policy. I said, we're not here to change the policy with you guys. We're here so that you understand. You're an advocate in the government, as well as MFE and other departments. So we've brought them up to speed from a farmer's perspective, what is wrong. In the last couple of weeks, there have been some big changes in MFE, MPI, where MPI are now, I think, much more in the tent. I think it was very much dominated by MFE in the past, whether that is a ministerial level or what the reason is, or it's just one agency. But I can see going forward there's going to be a lot more coming from MPI.
Yeah, cheers, Chris. Kim, I aid MPI to get to see what advice MPI officials have been providing to the Minister from about end of 2018 to start of 2019. And many of the concerns we've raised through our submissions, and in fact after the regs have landed, were put in front of the Minister as early as that point. So that answers your question in part, I imagine. And it goes to what Andrew was saying, that in terms of rural proofing, we've had these regulations for 3 months. Pre-election, there have already been a number of considerable changes, and it certainly looks like, as Andrew said, these have just been slammed through. And our understanding is MPI have had little input to that, as Chris says. Now MFE seem to be more open to what MPI are saying, because they understand that the regulations aren't as intended by Cabinet. And so we're both pointing out the impracticalities and also pointing to the Cabinet paper and the intent itself, and saying what you've landed here does not match that intent.
Yeah, and I'd just add that nothing that we've said today should be a shock to the Ministry for the Environment particularly, or the government. It's something that every government department was in some way, whether it be Treasury, flagging caution with the economy or others. These concerns were flagged throughout the submission process. The rural sector and others flagged the government the exact type of concerns we've been raising today. And one other little thing I'll throw in from an Otago point of view, we've had the Ministry for the Environment submitting on the Otago water plan changes just come through, because they don't like what Otago Regional Council was providing a pathway through for consent. So we've got some really high level interference from Ministry for the Environment and Regional Council matters, and that should be scary for everyone, not just those in Otago.
That's great, thank you. Now I've got a question in the middle of the crowd.
Yeah, thanks David, Clark and FedSIPs. This is, I guess, directed at most of the people from the Executive of Federated Farmers. David, Clark, you and I have been doing, and a lot of people in this room have been doing a lot with mental and rural well-being in the last year and a half. And you've been involved in the meetings that I run on Thursday night. Last Thursday night, we probably saw the most depressed group of farmers that I think I've ever put together in one meeting room. This is going to take us back to 1987 issues, you know, where we have got, it'll put our mental wealth and well-being back 20 years. What can we do to portray that through to the government or to people in the street, that this is actually the last straw that'll break their backs?
because this is the one thing. We can all put a cost per hectare, a cost per cow, and we can look at all those costs. But some of us that are facing, trying to help some of these people survive this, we can't put a cost on that.
Yeah, and I guess the key thing here is this is what the issue we need to get in front of the Prime Minister, because this is the Prime Minister's area. She's about the people and the fields and all that sort of stuff. It's not really my area, as you can tell. But this and we've talked about it at a board level. This is the sort of stuff we need to engage with her on and get her understanding around to try and really bring home the human cost, that it is not just, like you say, the economics or the environment. There is a human telly to all of this that they need to understand. And we are seeing it, those poor bastards in Southland, they are just getting smashed this year. I don't know how the hell they're coping. But weather event after weather event, on top of all the winter grazing, bloody spies flying drones over their farm. I just wouldn't be able to imagine how they can keep putting up with all that stuff. And so it's definitely a focus for us is trying to get that, how that's impacting, all of this is impacting on those farmers in front of the Prime Minister, but also what is the support out there that we can, along with the Rural Support Trust and all the other Ag Proud, these other organisations, what can we do to support them and helping them out?
I had a meeting with MPI the other day to try and get them to take it a bit more seriously, and they basically have no idea of the fallout yet. But I think it'll be in front of them pretty soon, especially if you can drive this home for us.
Thanks, Vicky. Look, we've raised this right at the top of MPI as well. We had a meeting the other day about 2 weeks ago. Look, even tonight, that is why we've put on something afterwards. It's just another thing, the whole COVID thing. Everyone's been in their isolation over winter and been busy on farms. It's just another way to get out. It's not the whole solution. It's just another one of those things. Whether it's support industries, having that barbecue, this is really big stuff. And we're only talking freshwater at the moment for tonight. But when you put climate change in there, the Prime Minister was talking about, there's going to be charges at the margin and all the stuff around the climate change, and there's the biodiversity stuff coming down the track. Farmers, and I'm really passionate about the whole stuff, that we do go on that journey of continuous improvement. It's when the regulators talk step change, that's when we lose. And we lose, you only have to lose one or two, and every one of those there's a family or there's heartache behind it. And I want to make sure everyone gets on this journey and gets to the other end, but not at step change pace. That's 1987 like you're talking about. And we've got to adapt to this changing world, and the world's changing more than what our regulation, and this is because of other things that have happened outside our borders. So, but we raise it at every particular point we can. If I'm talking just with the low officials in Wellington, we make sure we let them know that what the heartbeat's saying in mid-Canterbury.
Yeah, and just remember that anything that you are hearing on this, you're not in it alone. Talk to your neighbour, talk to family, talk to your catchment group, ring Rural Support Trust or Federated Farmers, because every time we do these farmer meetings, we've got the same concerns raised. The farming sector's all in this together, rural communities, the regions are all in this behind you, so everyone's going to continue fighting for this industry. It's important not just here but in the whole of New Zealand, so you're not alone, and I think that's the main thing we'd like people to take away. Don't feel isolated and alone. What you're feeling, everyone else is feeling or certainly sharing your concerns on.
That's great, thank you. Now we've got 1, 2, 3 and 4 across to you in a minute, Murray.
That's on. Kia ora everyone, my name's Megan. I am intending on being a third generation farmer in the Canterbury district, and I'm just finishing my thesis up at Lincoln University. So I'm right involved in agriculture as my passion, and I come across people, immediate family, I come across people in my studies who don't actually understand what agriculture is. And I think that's, for you guys at FEDS, And for everyone who's advocating for agriculture, our story is that we produce food. And I think we need to keep that at the forefront of when we're having these discussions, is that we're food producers. We're feeding the world. We're feeding New Zealanders. And we're feeding our neighbours. And I think that's the single most important part of this discussion. And so, to keep on feeding our world and feeding our neighbours, we need to be able to innovate, and to meet those regulations, we do need to improve our environmental goals. And we're doing that, we're working towards it. And that's, Kim, you touched on it, about the issue with these regulations being input-based. And that's where my concern stems from too, is when we control the inputs, we can't innovate. We're going to follow the prescription. So I guess my question for you guys is, how are you advocating against that, and what are you suggesting, not just against it, but what are you actually suggesting as a solution for how we can improve, but without that prescription?
Great question, Megan.
So you mean improve the environment without having national level direction? Is that? I mean that's basically what the MPS 2017 was doing, going to regions saying, look, we've got some issues here. You have to maintain or improve water quality. You do it in your regions, picking up what the gentleman was saying up there about some of those catchment-specific issues that people have no control over, setting an overall objective to maintain or improve. When the regulatory impact statement went through, they put a lot of weight on the idea that that farmers can suddenly add value to their farm production by demonstrating environmental provenance. So the person buying the meat in the supermarket in England suddenly pays twice as much because they've got the big green tick. What we know is that the environmental standards in other countries who produce their own foods generally are a lot worse than in our country. So it's the expectation within New Zealand that's driving those requirements. Now we're seeing Land and Water Aotearoa reported last week. Water quality is not great, but suddenly they are pointing the finger at urban areas and saying urban areas are terrible. These are the areas we really need to improve. So that conversation is switching. And just a personal story, I had my 8-year-old out on a farm in the weekend, and he saw the lambs bouncing around and suddenly decided he was vegan. And then we went and had a hamburger, and I made the connection with him. You know, the food you love eating is coming off a farm, and I think that's a connection that often we lose sight of. I'm a city dweller sitting there drinking my latte, and that's one of the things. There has to be that very clear connection between what the food we produce, what we enjoy as a country, food security, all that sort of thing, global context, and also a lot of people look at farming as an industry, and then they go and talk to a farmer, an individual farmer at the farm level, and suddenly there's a face to it. It's no longer farming as the big industry trying to make a profit off everything. Suddenly it's the farmer who's been there for, it's been 3 generations. They really care about their animals and the environment. I think that's where the focus needs to be.
Two extremes. Yeah. Thanks, Megan. I was just going to add, really, that nobody tonight has even suggested that we shouldn't be trying to improve our environmental footprint. And when I engage with farmers, I never hear that. I hear the pace of change, and what can we do, and what's reasonable, and if the government pushes too hard, are we still going to be in business in 5 years' time? So I don't hear anybody pushing back on our aspirations to improve stuff. And actually, interestingly enough, around the regional council table, the rural councillors, I think, probably have a far more practical attitude to improving our environment than some of the other councillors. So I'd just like to make that point. The second thing is that I was involved in developing the first MPS, the Freshwater, which set the first targets of nitrates at 6.9 and various other water quality attributes. And the most important part of that MPS was this concept of maintaining and improving. Now, if the governments had actually enforced that rule, we wouldn't need this essential freshwaters package, because in fact, if all regional councils had operated, as I said right from the start, the way the Canterbury Regional Council has done in terms of developing land and water plans to try to maintain and improve water bodies, then actually you wouldn't need any new legislation, because the whole of the country would be on that same path forward.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. Now, Megan, Thursday of every month, we could have a father-daughter combination coming along, so I look forward to it. Right, next question. Neil.
Yeah, thanks David, and David, thanks for bringing the team to Mid Canterbury and explaining what these policies are to us, and also Wiggy, thanks for raising your points you had, very important too. But just to answer, Andrew had a question there before, or did have a statement to say that there's been no economic analysis being done, and there hasn't. But I can tell you what we're doing at council is we have an agriculture advisor there, and I've asked for a report to be done financially on what it's going to mean for the Ashburton district, these policies, and we plan to have that out in about 2 weeks' time. So when it's out, it'll be shared with you all. It'll be Ashburton district values, and you'll be able to share it, and I'll be able to share it with my connections I have with mayoral forums and the like of the mayors all around the district. So we'll have financials for Ashburton district. No question there, but just a point.
Okay, that's good. Thanks very much. And no deadline there, Rich, by the looks of the boss in front of you. So, right, okay, sorry, we'll get across here in just a second. Right, sir.
Yeah, Chris Hampton, farming down South Canterbury on hills, sheep and beef. Our whole farm is over 10% gradient. The big part of our farming operation is winter. It's only our own stock, but winter in our stock. Do I have to? Even our lawn's over 10% gradient. And do I have to apply for, number one, a consent to be grown winter feed on over 10%? Do I need another consent to be able to sow my summer crops? It's because I'm going after the 1st of October, because it's too cold down there on the hills to be sowing anything. A lot of our stuff doesn't even put in clover. We're not going to be putting that into the middle of November. Do I need an extra consent there? And do I need a consent? Do I have to renew the consent every year? And is the consent available per the paddocks change every year? Do I need to change the consents for different paddocks each year?
Maybe a question that the Environment Canterbury can answer, but certainly from the conversations we've been having with Otago on this specifically, it would be one winter grazing consent that you would apply for, and as they've said, they don't have the resources to be doing these consents already, so they'll be making them as longer term as they can. So if you can show what your business plan is and your farm is consistent in its practices over a 5-year period, they'll look to try and give 5-year consents. And it would be over the farm if you can show that you've got you've considered your critical source areas, and you're looking at those sort of factors that you probably are already considering now as part of your farm plan. So one consent, yeah.
Yeah, exactly as Kim says. So the restricted discretionary pathway says that you've got to have impacts that are no greater than you would have under the permitted activity standard. So as Kim says, you'd want to lean very strongly on what mitigation actions you're taking, etc., farm planning actions you're taking. So hopefully, and I imagine the regional team will be working with Environment Canterbury to have a streamlined application process. It has to be robust that, if someone complains to the Environmental Protection Authority, they're not going to swoop in with the stormtroopers and say, right, you're doing it wrong. But there is a pathway there for you, and there is potential for a multi-year consent, so you don't have to do it each year.
Would the regional council, would the stormtroopers come and take the councillors away, or would they, because they gave the consent out, that wasn't good enough?
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So, microphone across there, Chris.
Murray's got a microphone.
Oh, Murray, do you want to start, and then we'll bounce back across?
Yeah, right. Is that on, David?
No. Yep. You go. Try again.
I'd like to thank you for calling this meeting tonight. Is that better? No?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's good. Well done.
Right. Thanks, David, for calling the meeting tonight. Very informative. My gripe is with the vets in general. I liken the situation where the chairman in Southland kicked the ball. It's like a game of rugby, and you go out and you kick the ball, and all you other vets guys stood there and watched and did nothing. The government on the other team raced away and scored. You know, there was no support for that guy down there. I want you to grow some balls. I want you to be some more radical. Think outside the square. You talk and talk and talk and bloody talk. And David Parker and his cohorts don't actually listen. They tell me he's quite intelligent. Yeah, he knows where to find good earplugs. Grow some balls, Andrew.
2 daughters, so I'm pretty sure I do have a set. Look, I mean, it comes down to the fact, yeah, I could rock in there, give him a punch in the head, that'll make you feel better, right? Will it improve the situation? No, it'll send it backwards. You want a rugby analogy? Here's my rugby analogy, okay, with a lot of this stuff. You're winning the game by about 2 points, you're in front of your own try line, and you go, guy falls over in the ruck, you go and kick him in the head or something, give away a penalty, lose the game. Makes you feel better in the instance. Has it won you the game? No, it's about winning the game. Right now, as far as Southland went, I gave them tons of support. I was on the phone to them daily. They talked it through, yep, they were going. Part of our strategy has been that the provinces can push it a little bit harder. At a national level, we keep the lines of communication open to Wellington with the officials so that we can talk through, and you know, they know the pressures out there. We're then pushing for the change. Okay? It is about the win. It isn't about feeling better by making a big rah-rah speech and going and thumping someone and driving a tractor up a step somewhere. We've got to win over the public. Now, if they see us as a bunch of inbred, knuckle-dragging, hillbilly Neanderthals, and I kind of fit that stereotype, unfortunately. So I've got to bloody work hard not to fulfil that stereotype. I mean, that is our strategy here. It is making sure, and like I said before, things are changing, okay? There will be more changes after the election. If those changes stop and we don't get to where we want them to go, then we ratchet it up a notch. But the plan is not to go straight to DEFCON 5 or DEFCON 1 or whatever it is, but to slowly work your way up, exhausting each step, and then, you know, if it gets to the fact that we have to do marches down Wellington, then we do it when we're getting nowhere else. At the moment, the team, the board, we feel like there is change happening. It may not appear it to everyone on the ground, but certainly we can see there is a willingness to listen and there is an appetite for change. Now, if we just go completely feral, that potentially comes off the cards, and then it's the government just goes and does all their negotiations with other people who fought to talk for you. And so that's our strategy. I'm not going to apologise for it. If people want to call me a pussy and whatever else, go for your life. But I honestly think that is the way that we are going to get a win out of this. Okay, it may not be instant gratification, but it's the long-term win we're after. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
And
that's all very well, Andrew, but all the talking for Southland, it got them a month delayed in their replanting time, and it got a delay to a year.
That was already in the regulations, and that was through hard fighting through submissions, which Federated Farmers did. I was on email chains where I could see Andrew talking not just daily, but regularly throughout the day giving support to Southland Federated Farmers, as were other provincial presidents around the country, as were policy staff. David was talking to them most days. They were not left alone. They were supported, guided, encouraged to make sure they were on the right legal and policy track. So I take offence on behalf of Andrew because I could see how much he was having to say and support them and allowing them to have a voice from a regional perspective. And the change from 1 month came through submissions from everyone in this room and across Otago, across the Southland and the country. So I respectfully disagree.
Look, if I could intervene here for just a minute, I'd have to say from a Mid-Canterbury Provincial President point of view, this is our response to what they did in Southland. Now, for what Southland was confronted with in the particular rules that impacted on Southland, they pushed back and they pushed back effectively, and they were backed up by the national organisation, and they've got the ministers walking backwards. And to have ministers walking backwards on legislation that hadn't yet been enacted, that's significant. So I hear what you're saying, Murray, but we felt here in Mid-Canterbury that our way of coming in and supporting what Jeffrey and Bernadette, being the Southland President and Vice President, were doing was to call you here tonight. And all of you that have taken the time to come out here tonight have responded to that call. So we have once a month a provincial president's call where we're updated by the national board, and we have intermediary meetings should the need arise. So 2 months ago when I said to the national board on that call, I want to run a meeting in Mid-Canterbury to follow on from the meeting that we had so successfully here in October last year. I had the full support immediately from the national board to run this. Now, that support I think can be seen here today with the quality of staff, the team that's sitting there in front of you, and the work they've put into the presentation to come and report back to you. So there's a number of ways that we're going to respond to this. It may be at some stage in the future that we're driving tractors, but the time's not yet. But our way, I felt, as Mid-Canterbury Provincial President, was that we could respond with some credibility by having a fact-based presentation that you could all listen to and understand what the impacts on your business were. And then the good thing about the way Federated Farmers operates with the provinces, with it being a bottom-up organisation, the provinces have autonomy to lead. There's the opportunity for other provinces to now follow on from what we're doing and build on that. And if we can just keep chipping away and be that dripping voice of reason, both with the public and with the government that might get a little bit more sensitive to this, maybe we'll have a bit of some effect. Now, one of the things we've done tonight is that we've recorded this so that we can then put it online and get it circulated to a wider audience than is here tonight, and hopefully maybe even get people within government to sit and listen to the discussions that were had here tonight and hopefully take on board some of those things. So let's just keep at it, bit at a time, and we'll hopefully push back. But I certainly would have to say that we have the support of the board to do this.
Yes, I'll just add to that. And being smart, when this whole process came out, the last iteration of the final regulation, as a board, how are we going to respond? And it's being smart. If we go nuclear, like Andrew used the word fuel, if you go nuclear, you've got to have something in behind you. You've used all your energy, and you better have a program in behind it. If you've gone up on a big puff of smoke, there's nothing there. So that's where we are being smart. We're making sure the first stage is everyone's informed about what this means. The next stage is making sure that the bureaucrats in Wellington are informed about what it means, because as policy people, it's all very well you can think about most things, but the more we get people informed, the more of those examples that come out, and you can have a much more fulsome discussion. So in the feedback that's going to government at the moment, it's not only the outcomes that we want, it's the reasons why, because a lot of the stuff we push back and we just say, this is what you've got to change. We're actually trying to tell them now why, this is the real why farmers need these changes. So that I used an example the other day, a pugging paddock. I said, can you describe to me a pug in the paddock? Is it four hoof prints in a square metre or whatever? And they says, oh, you're being too technical, Chris. And I said, okay, can you give me a photo of what what you think complies and a photo of what doesn't comply. Because I said every day as a farmer, I'm out there looking at that and I want to judge it. But at the moment, you're trying to put stuff in words that is really hard to translate into words. You're having problems with it, I'm having even more problems, and I do not want to get prosecuted because of your dumb rules. So there's the angle that we've got to try and keep on chipping away. And like Andrew says, when we've run out of any sort of traction, then there's other tools will come out of the toolbox. We can't just be all one shot wonder.